He was instrumental in organizing the conference last November that took place in Nuremberg to celebrate the 60th anniversary of the beginning of the Nuremberg trial. And it is particularly fitting, took, I think, my role, Leila's role, and Larry May's role. He told me that just a few days ago, or shortly ago, the papers presented at that conference have been published, now out. This is information, I think, outside. I want to please tell all of the participants, we hope to be able to do something similar with a special issue, a symposium issue of our Global Studies Law Review, which will be the counterpart to this volume that Christoph has put together so ably. I think it is also particularly fitting to have a voice, an academic voice from young Germany.
Thank you. Thank you, John, for this kind introduction. Ladies and gentlemen, 60 years ago, the trial against the 22 major war criminals before the International Military Tribunal in Nuremberg came to an end after 218 days of court session. We convene here today to commemorate this remarkable event by reflecting upon the effects it has upon us today. It is a great privilege for me to have been asked to participate in this incredible conference here in St. Louis. I have the impression, looking around in the audience, that international criminal law at this very moment is dormant, because everybody who usually makes it work and runs it is present in this room. And yet, ladies and gentlemen, at the same time, I feel a little bit uneasy, or let's say, astonished. The topic you have entrusted to me, a world of peace under the rule of law, a view from Europe, raises a rather heavy burden at a conference remembering the conviction of those responsible for the greatest humanitarian catastrophe ever committed on the European continent. I have been asked to speak about a world of peace, while ironically I possess the same nationality as those convicted criminals 60 years ago. 60 years after the Nuremberg trials, you have shown with respect. You have shown with this request that you have gained a substantial amount of trust in German people, from a country where the Nazis had abolished every democratic principle, all individual liberties, by dissolving the separation of powers, to discuss with you the global rule of law. Well, you might say that 60 years is a long time. Well, it might be for individual lives. But the recent discussion about a German military contribution to the enforcement of Security Council Resolution 1701 and the deployment of German troops to the Middle East proves the opposite. In international relations, 60 years are but a short moment, like a blinking of an eye. Taking all this into account, I must humbly endeavour to reflect on the experiences and lessons learned or not learned from the past 60 years. I do this as a fairly young German criminal law professor who grew up under extremely secure and peaceful circumstances, which is not least due to the presence of the US Army in Germany over these decades. Ladies and gentlemen, eternal peace is one of the oldest dreams of the world. However, peace seems to be something unusual, even something transcendent, not to be achieved on this earthly side of life, not by accident. The report of the birth of Christ in the Bible mentions the fact that peace was on earth at this very moment. Peace is associated with the kingdom of God, with paradise. The human experience of life is quite different. The status naturalis, writes the great German philosopher Immanuel Kant, is a state of war. Even if there's no permanent armed conflict, he says, there is a permanent threat of a violent outbreak. The question now is what to do with this ambiguity. Experience shows that human beings are both good and evil at the same time, whereas each individual has the ability to use his or her fist he also has the ability to restrain from using violence. He has the urge to harm or even kill his wrongdoer, while at the same time he dreams of a well-ordered life in peace. At a regional level, the establishing of an executive power that holds the monopoly to use force, that means implementing a state structure, works fairly well in preventing private wars, as Grotius said, and in thus upholding a peaceful coexistence within a country. A republican constitution, in the Kantian sense, the republican constitution of a state which is committed to equality and liberty of the person, is thus a corollary of reason in order to channel and control everyday aggression. The Rechtsstaat, which is the German term of the rule of law, is generally capable to guarantee peace and security in the interior, and it does that by three pillars, as the Federal Constitution according to Germany says. By one, respecting civil liberties, which are called basic rights, according to the German Constitution. Second, by establishing reliable procedural structures. And thirdly, by establishing an independent and reliable judiciary. The obvious question now is, can these principles now be transferred to a global peace as much as it guarantees a national peace? In his treatise, Eternal Peace, of 1794, Immanuel Kant has elaborated on this and proposed two hypotheses. First, Kant presumed that any well-ordered democratic society will not start wars because it would be unreasonable for the citizens to vote in favor of their own corporal and economic suffering. Citizens would not start such an evil game. Second, Kant further suggested that as a global state is not desirable, the sovereign national state should be incorporated into a league of nations, a league of peace. Such a league would have no monopoly of power as a national democratic state has, but is based on bilateral and multilateral treaties amongst equal states. Kant, thus, did not transfer his republican ideas onto the international level, apart from his notion of a jus cosmopoliticum, the use of the notion of human rights. This vision, in my respect, is rather realistic. However, hypothesis 1 has been proven to be empirically wrong, as democratic states do go to war. Hypothesis 2 is realistic, as public international law is still operating at exactly at this Westphalian level, but it has not succeeded in establishing eternal peace thus far. My hypothesis is that the missing of an independent mandatory judiciary, of an application of the rule of law in international relations, is exactly the reason for this failure. The vision that reason will prevail and a democratic structure will prevent wars is well-founded according to the experiences in national states. To appeal to man's reason alone, however, is too weak. Power must be separated, channeled, and its use controlled. The national state has to subdue itself to outside control. I want to substantiate my point by looking at the 19th and 20th century history on Europe, which can be described by a number of achievements and dramatic setbacks regarding the dream of a world without war. We can observe the attempts to subdue international relations to the rule of law. We can also observe the establishing and development of truly democratic states in Europe. But for a long time, this did not put an end to wars. War as a means of politics was perfectly acceptable during the 19th century. According to the maxim, expansion is everything, formulated by Cecil Rhodes, European states colonized, suppressed, and exploited amongst the entire hemisphere. These wars took place in faraway countries, but even Europe at that time was full of wars. German unity in 1871 was coerced by military force, first by military occupation of Germany's northern part by Prussia, second by the German-German War in 1866, the so-called Bruderkrieg, Brothers' War, and thirdly by the Franco-German War of 1870-1871. In international relations, we have discovered a considerable amount of disparity. On the one hand, several world peace conferences were held at the turn of the century, aiming at preventing harm done by wars, The lay law was crafted during this time, giving some substance to the rudimentary bones of the Eucin bellows. On the other hand, Europe was on the route to a disaster, the disaster being the First World War, often referred to as a Great War, la Grande Guerre, although I don't really know what is great with 10 million casualties. Rather shortly after the agreements concerning the prohibition of the use of gas, and after consenting on the Martens Clause outlawing unnecessary suffering in warfare as a principle of humanitarian law, the battlefields in France were spoiled with bodies corroded by mustard gas. We feel the ambiguity in international relations here, the ambiguity I've described at the beginning of my presentation. The catastrophic end of the First World War in Europe was followed by several steps meant to prevent further conflicts of this kind. At first, Germany, identified as the aggressor in the Treaty of Versailles, was restricted by a severe control of its armament. Secondly, a criminalization of violations of international law was contemplated, but did not prevail in the end. Neither the emperor, and we've heard that in this during this conference, neither the emperor was prosecuted because the principle of immunity for heads of state was considered a hindrance, nor were other military or political leaders prosecuted on an international level. The national trials, which Germany was coerced to hold against a handful of army leaders, was nothing else than mockery trials. The so-called Leipziger Prozesse, the Leipzig trials, are a clear sign that the society of the classical 19th century nation-state viewed warfare as a matter of national pride and military honor. Thirdly, the Kantian idea of an international league was included in the 1990s with the Treaty of Versailles coinciding with the foundation of the League of Nations. A new age of international relation was meant to begin, the rule of law was meant to be introduced, the permanent court of justice as a judicial branch as a means for the separation of powers. In the meantime, Germany attempted to transform itself into a democratic state with a rather fine, balanced democratic constitution which was drafted mainly by the renowned German scholar Hugo Preuss. The so-called Weimarer Republik was founded. Yet the new constitution, based on the ideal of a Volksstaat, a state of the people, was not supported by a majority of Germans. It has thus been called democracy without democrats. And indeed, the old national thinking and the dishonor of the military defeat were present in the minds of the Germans. Likewise, the new democracy was not equipped with means capable to deal with the political struggles between communists and fascists on the streets of Berlin. The attempts to establish the rule of law nationally and internationally failed. Both the League of Nations and the Weimarer Republik in Germany were not well equipped to deal with attacks from within. The finest democratic states, it seems, is useless if there is no will to support it. An international league is worthless if it is not carried by the will of the people to give up a piece of sovereignty. It is rather devastating and depressing, as a horrific disaster of the First World War was not disheartening enough as to convey the peoples of Europe to really change their way of thinking. Thus, power still prevailed over reason. The consequences of this failure, as you all know, were dramatic. Inside Germany, the newly elected Führer Adolf Hitler abandoned all democratic structure and imposed a fascist totalitarian regime. In September 1939, the Second World War began and ended in the total destruction of civilization and humanity. At that point, ladies and gentlemen, the world needed a new order, back to start, as it were. In contrast to the lax prosecution of war criminals after World War I, the Allied powers now decided to hold a spectacular trial and show the entire world that aggression and war crimes are being followed by a severe punishment. This, I might say, is a turning point in European history. This being taking place 60 years before today. The Nuremberg trial indeed is, as Jackson said in his opening address, the most significant tribute that power has ever paid to reason. The Jacksonian trial held at Nuremberg taught Europe and Germany that hate and revenge can be channeled by a criminal trial, power can be controlled, and the most heinous crimes can be answered by the rule of law. The criminal law, by the way, is not the only means in this reconciliation process that Europe was to undergo. Alongside the criminal prosecution, Germany compensated the victims widely with the Federal Compensation Act until the 1960s, and after the moratorium of the 1948 London Agreement, the fund Remembrance, Responsibility and Future was to compensate, again, for forced labour and other losses during the Third Reich. I brushed this without drafting very positively, without taking heed to the difficulties you are all aware of, and the coercing that was needed in order for Germany to actually establish this very fund. Attempts to establish a global institution which would be the basis of a new world order led to the foundation of the United Nations. It was meant to be an institution for all peace-loving nations. Aggression would be ruled out and a collective system of peace and security was to be established. However, the United Nations is not a success story. What is missing for the functioning of the rule of law is a mandatory judiciary. The ICJ is not the kind of institution that could serve as a reliable backbone to the rule of law. It is too weak and looks more like an arbitration tribunal without mandatory competences. Nevertheless, the UN provides a forum for discussion and at least a theoretical structure which sadly is only adhered to on a loose, voluntary level whenever it suits the most powerful players in the global game. The last century, ladies and gentlemen, in world history has shown that in international relations, reason does not prevail over power as long as power is not separated and thus controlled. The hypothesis of Kant that a democratic state would not go to war has shown to be unrealistic. Democratic states don't seem to be less likely to go to war, but they go to war for different reasons and with different means, as the German philosopher Jürgen Habermas observes. War still is the continuation of politics with different means. And of course, justification is different. We don't call it necessary expansion or economic interests. We now call it humanitarian intervention or state building. We must not forget, ladies and gentlemen, that a war is a horrible thing and it is wrong everywhere at any time. War must be prevented, be it unjust or be it justifiable. Where do the peoples of Europe stand today, ladies and gentlemen? Let me finally reflect on the idea of establishing peace and security which was followed by Europe. Churchill proposed on September 20th in 1946 the following in his famous speech in Zurich. What is a sovereign remedy? Is it to recreate a European fabric, or as much of it as we can, and to provide it with a structure under which we can dwell in peace, in safety and freedom? We must build a kind of United States of Europe. In this way, only will hundreds of millions of toilers be able to regain the simple joy and hopes which make life worth living. The process is simple. All that is needed is to resolve of hundreds of millions of men and women to do right instead of wrong, and to gain as a reward blessing instead of cursing. Unquote. And Europe indeed embarked on this way. To heal the wounds and prevent a similar outbreak in the future, the main European powers decided to establish a close tie of contracts. A close tie of contracts and unite under one constitution, if you want. This was done in a twofold way. First, economically, also taking up a Kantian idea, I might say, by the foundation of the European communities. And secondly, with regards to human rights, by the foundation of the Council of Europe and the ratification of the European Convention on Human Rights. Both, by the way, institutions to which the United Kingdom was on board, although Churchill in his speech just quoted did not count the UK amongst the states of Europe. The success of the European community, which was later founded as the European Union, is, in my estimation, due to two facts. First, a general will on the member states to grow together, giving no prevalence to state sovereignty. And second, the mandatory judiciary. The European Court of Justice has rather quickly turned into a driving force for the European integration. It took the post of a watchdog, enforcing and fulfilling the obligations by the member states. The court is one of the most important European institutions, the most progressive in terms of its innovativeness, often anticipating the political will, critics of course say, ultra-vires. This engine of integration, however, is dependent on the restrictions of state sovereignty tolerated by the member states. These restrictions are the oil without which the engine would soon collapse. A similar story can be told of the Council of Europe. The European Convention on Human Rights is embedded into a supranational system of cooperation and supervision for the protection of human rights. The European Court of Human Rights hands down judgments which are accepted as legally binding to its member states. Considering the importance and the quantity of the cases of the European Court of Human Rights, as Mark Janis observes, he has turned into an ordinary constitutional court. Again, we can observe a judiciary which is acceptable as binding to the member states and thus cuts back on sovereignty of the national state. Without this, however, the recognition and success of the European Convention on Human Rights would have failed. Let me say this, as we have mentioned, the Military Commission Act, which has been passed or is about to be passed in this country. And considering this as a European, I would have no doubt whatsoever that the European Court of Human Rights would, as soon as it has a case in front of it, intervene and declare this to be against this, an act like this to be against human rights. The European Union, which has already formally established one unionship, ran towards the aim of creating one political entity, one United States of Europe, as it were. However, the dream of one state-like unity under one constitution has come to a halt. The European train, which seemed at full speed, suddenly met a red signal when attempting to ratify the draft constitution, which failed to be ratified in several member states. The European Union has to accept that the political will to even tie the member states closer together has as yet not met the people's majority within Europe. At the same time, like the Federal Constitutional Court in Germany, amongst other courts in Europe, declared the European arrest warrant unconstitutional and void, as this European statute disregards national traditions and legal cultures. The European unification process has been too quick, too undemocratic, and has thus lost contact with the sentiments of the citizens. Time out now for a unified Europe, one might say, and yet precious time to reflect and stabilize the process as it is. Germany has always been one of the driving forces for European unification, even more so after Germany's own miraculous unification. German unity can only be lived to its fullness within a strong European Union, which is committed to the promotion of basic and human rights and controls the national state by restricting its sovereignty. The entire process of European integration from the 1950s up to date proves the fact that adherence to the rule of law guarantees peace amongst states. Europe as a society which for centuries fought one war after the other has experienced 60 years of peace because it has learned that the national state, which has full and uncontrolled sovereignty, can turn into an aggressor against its own people and against its neighboring states. Cooperating with a strict supranational controlling instance is a model that worked well as a basis for peace and security in Europe. Now, I'm not saying that all of this is a lesson learned from Nuremberg, although a lot of it is. Germany, however, learned from the Nuremberg trial and subdued itself to strong European bondages. The German constitution is based, as Jackson rightly observes, on the Nuremberg principles. And I can only bow my head in respect and thankfulness to the prosecutors still alive, to Whitney, to Ben, and to Henry, who taught us this lesson. Because of them, the German people could develop into a truly free and democratic society. Ladies and gentlemen, global peace is still a dream. Hopes that the end of the East-Western conflict would terminate wars turned out to be fallacious. Ethnic and religious conflicts continue to rise, and a new form of violence, terrorism, shows the world its ugly face. I don't have a strict answer to this problem. However, a European view, as I've tried to argue, would be based on three pillars. First, human rights are at the center of democracy. Second, the state sovereignty is subsidiary to the respect of human and other basic rights. And third, state power needs to be controlled by a supranational judiciary which is generally accepted as issuing binding decisions. The Nuremberg trial, which we commemorate at this hour, fulfilled all three requirements. Germany had at first difficulties accepting the judgment, but we have learned that it is a dictate of reason for the national state to subdue itself to the rule of law and to accept a supranational control and intervention. A strong international criminal law and a strong ICC does exactly this, controls power. It is but one pillar for the establishing of an international rule of law, by far not the only one. There is state responsibility, civil responsibility, which have to be made applicable at a supranational level as well. There needs to be a real monopoly of the use of force and human rights monitoring systems. In that view, Immanuel Kant was wrong, that he thought sovereignty is an unalterable principle in international law. Quite the contrary is true. The national state only then discovers the full enjoyment of sovereignty and liberty if it is ready to voluntarily give up a piece of sovereignty for the betterment of the international community as a whole, just as, in the words of Justice Udo Di Fabio at the German Federal Constitutional Court, just as the modern human being conceives him or herself as a sovereign, born as a free individual but conscious to the necessity of voluntary bonding and to the joy in social community. At the end, ladies and gentlemen, this might be a call from Europe. Please, do not abandon the Nuremberg legacy. Thank you very much.
We'll go ahead and have questions now, and then I will turn it in, because we won't treat this as a panel, but as separate.
Yes, please. I try to address this task by looking back at first. The Nuremberg trials weren't very well received at first, I would say. Soon after the war, during the trials, the German people was very much busy with other things, i.e. organizing everyday life. And they couldn't follow the trials as much as the media coverage was rather low in the fact that there was no daily newspaper, there was no television, there was radio broadcasting now and then. The only thing actually that did work was the so-called Wochenschau. I don't know whether you're aware of that. This is an institution that actually Goebbels sort of invented in order to foster his PR machinery. When you go to a theatre and watch a movie, before the movie would start, you would have news, the weekly news. And that was perfect for Goebbels to sort of spread his ideology, or the Nazi ideology. And now, after the war, Germany continued this practice, and you have quite a wide coverage of the Nuremberg trials in this Wochenschau. So everybody who went to the cinema to see a movie was well aware of Jackson's opening address, and as far as I can tell by letters dating from that time, German people were quite thankful for this address. Because the sentiment, of course, was that those people who were sitting in the dock in Nuremberg were the ones responsible for the suffering every German had to endure at this very moment. And that deflected very much from the sense of collective guilt. And this was welcomed by Germans. As soon as this notion sprang up again, the notion of collective guilt, also by Justice Jackson, who watered down a little bit during the process, by the prosecution of the organizations, the Nazi organizations. And indeed, I also have the impression by the denazification process, which had this sudden presumption that all the Germans sort of cooperated with the Nazi system. This sort of made German general opinion turn into a rather negative sort of, reception of the Nuremberg process at all, entirely. And it became obvious that it is very, very difficult to judge on one's own past. After the 1950s, after the foundation of the German Federal Republic of Germany, when the German courts were called upon to prosecute former Nazi criminals, because it was a horrible disaster, it didn't really happen. Those trials that did take place were not convincing, and rather justifying and excusing the Nazi criminals as much as was possible. And for a long time also, the German general public, I think, didn't really care or didn't even realize the extent of the Holocaust. It took the Eichmann case, but in particular the Auschwitz case in the 60s, when first the German population was actually confronted with the Holocaust and its extent. Well, we have a major change after unification. Maybe for two reasons. First of all, we are in a different setting now. Germany is unified. Germany has now a different international responsibility, as it were. And second, because we suddenly face the same problem. Because we have now another part of Germany, eastern part of Germany, who also had a totalitarian regime. And we need to prosecute those people who are responsible for that regime, for the suppressing of the East Germans. And that turned out to be a rather difficult task, and actually put the West German judges now more or less in the same position as the judges in Nuremberg were, because they were, as it were, the victors, sitting over the vanquished, the East Germans who lost, as it were, the Cold War. And of course, another reason for the sudden swing in public opinion towards Nuremberg and international criminal law in general was a change of generation, because I think that new, fresh blood, people who didn't endure and suffer the wartime or the post-war time, people like Hans-Peter Kaul who were very committed to the idea of an international criminal court. They sprang up, and suddenly there was a different attitude. Also, a change of government. The Chancellor Schröder and the Red-Green coalition had suddenly a different approach to it. But in the face of it, ladies and gentlemen, this change in attitude is also a late attempt, I have the impression, which is totally justified, a late attempt to maybe justify the Nuremberg trials entirely. Because the obvious criticism is that Nuremberg was victor's justice, is a discriminating approach to international criminal law, only prosecuting the vanquished and not taking heed to the victors. And by now establishing one institution that would apply international criminal law undiscriminately would, after all, justify also the Nuremberg trial. That much. Does it answer your question? That was a long answer, so I'd rather step down.